She thought I was nothing, a lowly waitress she could humiliate in front of everyone. But she had no idea that the man standing behind me controlled everything she ever cared about. The evening had begun like any other gala in the city's most exclusive hotel, chandeliers glittering, soft music floating in the air, every guest dressed to perfection. But nothing about tonight would be ordinary for me. I had been working as a waitress there for months, invisible to the high society that surrounded me, serving champagne, smiling politely, and silently observing every cruel remark, every arrogance-soaked glance that passed across the room. I had learned to keep my head down, to be quiet, to survive without drawing attention. But when she walked in, Victoria, the so-called social queen, dripping in diamonds and confidence, a sneer permanently etched on her face, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. She scanned the room like a predator, then her eyes landed on me, and I knew immediately that tonight she had chosen me as her target. She walked straight up, dragging her hand along my uniform, smirking at the tiny stain she pretended to notice. "This dress is ridiculous," she said loudly, making sure every guest within earshot could hear. "Honestly, can anyone be so pathetic and still call themselves a woman?" Her laughter rang across the room, cruel, sharp, designed to cut me down where everyone could watch. My hands shook slightly, my heart racing, but I refused to show her fear. Every instinct told me to shrink, to vanish, but something inside me told me this night would change everything. Guests turned to watch, whispers spreading like wildfire. Even the waitstaff froze, unsure if they should intervene. I felt exposed, humiliated, but I held my chin high, my eyes steady on her. Then she did it. She grabbed the fabric of my uniform and ripped it, deliberately, with a triumphant smile, as if she had declared victory over me in front of everyone. The room gasped. I heard a faint murmur of shock from the other staff, but Victoria's laughter drowned it out. She was proud, thinking she had humiliated me completely, and in that moment, I felt the familiar ache of invisibility, of being underestimated, of being dismissed by someone who could not see my worth. But then a voice cut through the tension, low, commanding, and impossible to ignore. "Victoria," my husband said, calm, his presence filling the room like gravity itself. The laughter stopped abruptly. She turned slowly, expecting maybe amusement, maybe a smile, but instead she was met with cold precision. Every guest turned their attention toward him, the man she had married, the billionaire she thought she could control, the man who now radiated a quiet, unstoppable authority. "You think this is funny?" he asked, voice calm but dangerous, each word deliberate. "You think tearing her dress in front of everyone is clever?" Victoria froze, the color draining from her face, realizing that her humiliation had turned into her own exposure. The air shifted instantly. Whispers of awe, shock, and tension rippled through the room. She had no idea that the woman she mocked was protected by the most powerful man in the building, the one who held influence over every deal, every investor, every connection she had ever relied upon. And in that moment, I saw a flash in my husband's eyes, a mix of calm fury, protective pride that made my heart surge with relief and determination. This was the turning point. I would no longer be invisible. I would no longer allow anyone to diminish me. He stepped closer to Victoria, the subtle authority in his posture demanding respect, commanding silence. Every guest knew something was about to happen, some reckoning, some demonstration of power, and I felt the electricity in the room shift entirely. Victoria's arrogance faltered, the smirk disappearing from her lips, replaced by panic, confusion, and disbelief. She had underestimated not only me, but the man behind me. And as I straightened my back, fixed the rip in my uniform as best I could, and met her gaze, I realized this was more than a defense, it was a statement. Cruelty has consequences, arrogance can be exposed, and sometimes the most underestimated person is the one who holds the true power in their hands. The room had gone completely silent. the air thick with tension and disbelief. Every guest frozen as if waiting to see what would happen next. Victoria's usual confidence had vanished, replaced by sharp panic, her eyes darting between me and my husband as if searching for some escape that didn't exist. I straightened my shoulders, my pulse racing, but my expression remained calm, controlled, because I knew that in this moment my dignity was more important than fear, my composure more powerful than her cruelty. My husband's presence was enough to make everyone else in the room realize that she had miscalculated completely, that her arrogance and disdain had blinded her to the true authority that stood behind me. He stepped forward, voice steady, commanding attention without shouting. "This behavior is unacceptable," he said. "She is not here for your entertainment. Your actions have consequences, and you will face them." The words landed like a hammer strike, precise, undeniable, leaving Victoria unable to respond. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her lips trembled as if forming words that she could not speak. The guests whispered among themselves, some glancing nervously at her, some casting approving looks toward me, finally recognizing that the humiliation she had tried to inflict had completely backfired. I felt a surge of confidence. For months, I had endured subtle sneers, whispered comments, and dismissive gestures, but now everything had changed. I was no longer just the invisible waitress. Tonight I was seen, protected, respected. Victoria attempted a weak smile, an effort to reclaim control, but my husband's cold stare stopped her in her tracks. He continued, outlining the repercussions of her actions in calm, deliberate words, detailing how such behavior reflected not just on her, but on her husband, her influence, and every business connection they had relied upon. The subtle threat was clear: humiliation and arrogance would no longer be tolerated, and I was no longer powerless. Guests exchanged glances, some impressed, some shocked, but all understanding that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. I took a step forward, my own voice calm, steady, yet carrying the weight of authority I had claimed through my husband's support and my own silent endurance. "I am not afraid of you," I said, making sure every word was heard, "and your attempts to belittle me have only shown your true nature." Victoria faltered, her eyes widening, realizing that her carefully crafted image of control and superiority had crumbled entirely in this room, in front of everyone who mattered. My husband smiled faintly, a gesture of subtle approval and reassurance, letting me know that he believed in me, that together we were stronger than any humiliation or cruelty she could conjure. The moment stretched, charged with electricity, as every guest realized they were witnessing more than just a confrontation. They were seeing a reckoning, a demonstration of what it means to command respect, to endure injustice with composure, and to turn vulnerability into strength. Victoria tried to speak again, a trembling voice attempting apology or excuse, but it came out weak, hollow, and ineffective. Every guest could sense her defeat, and I felt a quiet, triumphant satisfaction, not in vengeance, but in the undeniable assertion of dignity and authority. My husband stepped slightly behind me, giving me space to hold my head high, and I realized that the humiliation I had endured before this moment, the countless times I had been underestimated, had all been preparation for this. Every sneer, every cruel glance had been fuel for the fire that now burned steadily, controlled, and strong within me. Victoria's husband, who had always looked to her with admiration or fear, now seemed unsure, hesitant, as if questioning everything he had once believed about her, about himself, about the balance of power in their lives. And I knew, in that moment, that the night had completely shifted. No longer was she the one in control. No longer could arrogance and cruelty dictate the room, and no longer would anyone underestimate me. I had taken the first step toward complete empowerment, and with my husband's unwavering support, nothing could take it away. After the initial shock faded, Victoria's pride shattered completely, but the room still held a tense energy, as if everyone was waiting for the next move in this unspoken battle. I could feel every gaze upon me, measuring, judging, some with admiration, some with disbelief. I straightened my uniform, adjusted my posture, and refused to let the humiliation from earlier define me. My husband's eyes met mine across the room, a silent signal of trust, encouragement, and strength. He had given me the shield I needed, but now it was time to take the sword. Victoria attempted to compose herself, smoothing her dress, arranging her hair, trying to reclaim control. But every gesture came off as desperate, weak, and painfully obvious to everyone present. She approached me cautiously, her voice trembling as she tried to mask fear with arrogance. I didn't mean for this to happen, she stammered, though no one could believe her. Her attempt to excuse her cruelty only highlighted the stark contrast between her arrogance and my calm composure. I tilted my head slightly, allowing the subtle power in my silence to speak louder than any words could. The guests were captivated, some leaning forward, whispering, watching intently, sensing the tension, the drama, the shift of power that had occurred in this room. Then my husband stepped closer, resting a protective hand lightly on my shoulder, asserting his authority without raising his voice. "Victoria, this behavior reflects not only on you, but on everyone who surrounds you," he said firmly, his tone carrying the weight of influence, control, and unshakable certainty. She froze, realizing the implications were far greater than personal humiliation. Her social reputation, her husband's respect, and every business connection she relied on were now teetering on the edge because of her arrogance. I could see the panic in her eyes, but instead of gloating, I chose to maintain grace, letting her see the true measure of what she had lost. The room shifted again as murmurs spread, whispers of awe and judgment. Other guests exchanged glances, understanding that witnessing this confrontation was a rare privilege, a lesson in power dynamics, human dignity, and the consequences of cruelty. Victoria's hand trembled as she reached toward me, maybe seeking apology, maybe testing if her social influence could still intimidate me. But it was clear she had underestimated the depth of strength that patience, endurance, and support could build. I took a slow, deliberate step back, creating a visual boundary that emphasized control, authority, and self-respect. My posture, my steady gaze, my refusal to respond with fear, all conveyed a message far stronger than any words could. My husband nodded once subtly, approvingly, letting her and everyone else know that she had lost. Not with loud confrontation, but with the undeniable assertion of presence, dignity, and quiet power. Victoria finally faltered completely, her face pale, lips pressed tight, shoulders slumped. She had hoped to humiliate, to dominate, to assert superiority, but instead, she had exposed her weakness in front of everyone, her arrogance undone by calm confidence and unwavering support. I could feel the room breathing with me, as though the collective energy of every person there acknowledged that the tide had turned. In that moment, I realized that humiliation is temporary, but dignity, authority, and resilience are eternal. I had not only survived the cruel attack, but I had also claimed my rightful place in this room, in the eyes of the crowd, and in the knowledge of my own worth. My husband's presence reminded everyone that power is not about arrogance or wealth alone. It is about respect, intelligence, and moral authority, and together we had created an unshakable front. Victoria, who had come expecting to assert control, now faced the reality of her miscalculation. Her humiliation, her fear, and her loss of dominance were undeniable, and the crowd saw it all. I remained calm, composed, aware that this was only the beginning, but confident that from this moment forward, the balance had shifted irreversibly, and no one would ever doubt me again. Victoria's face was still pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and fear, but the room had shifted completely. Guests, who had arrived expecting glamour and shallow spectacle, were now watching a lesson in true power and dignity unfold. I could feel the weight of their stares, some approving, some judging, but all captivated. My husband stayed quietly by my side, his presence an unspoken shield, but I realized that I didn't need it anymore. I had found my own strength. Victoria took a step toward me, her movements hesitant, as if every nerve in her body screamed to retreat. Yet her pride held her back from leaving entirely. I don't understand how you," she began, her voice trembling, faltering under the weight of the silent crowd. I held up my hand, signaling her to stop, my own voice calm but firm, resonant with authority. "You understand perfectly," I said, my eyes steady, unwavering. "You chose cruelty over compassion, arrogance over humanity, and now you must live with the consequences." The room was silent except for the faint hum of tension, like a held breath waiting for the storm to break. Victoria's hands twitched as if she wanted to grab control back, to manipulate or humiliate again, but I could see the truth in her panic. She had no power here. I had it, and I had claimed it with quiet strength, patience, and resilience. My husband nodded ever so slightly, the faintest sign of approval, and I felt an indescribable surge of confidence. I had endured months of dismissal, mockery, and condescension, yet here I stood, unwavering, seen, and respected. Victoria faltered, her voice cracking as she tried another feeble argument. But it was empty, hollow, and irrelevant. The guests around us shifted, some exchanging incredulous glances, others subtly whispering, understanding that this confrontation was more than social drama. It was a lesson in human dignity, moral authority, and the consequences of arrogance. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me, not from fear, but from power, from clarity, from the realization that I had emerged stronger, more self-assured, and entirely in control of my response to cruelty. Victoria's husband looked equally stunned, perhaps for the first time seeing the stark contrast between arrogance and true authority, wealth and influence, power and respect. I had no desire to humiliate further, no need for revenge. My calm, my composure, and my refusal to shrink had done more than words or anger ever could. Victoria's expression faltered again, realization dawning too late that the night's events had exposed her weakness, her lack of control, and the fragile arrogance she had relied upon for so long. I took a step forward, letting my presence fill the space between us, commanding respect, dignity, and attention. The room seemed to exhale collectively, as if acknowledging the complete shift in energy, the undeniable display of moral power, and the triumph of quiet resilience over open cruelty. My husband's protective yet restrained stance reminded everyone that true strength is not loud or brash, it is deliberate, calm, and grounded. Victoria, who had once laughed at my supposed inferiority, now faced the reality that her arrogance had no effect, her cruelty had failed, and her dominance had crumbled entirely in front of everyone who mattered. I realized then that this was more than a confrontation. It was the reclamation of my identity, my self-respect, and my rightful place, not as a meek servant of society, but as a woman unshaken by humiliation, empowered by patience, and supported by undeniable moral and personal authority. And in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that nothing could ever make me invisible or powerless again. The tension in the room had reached its peak. Every guest silently aware that they were witnessing a confrontation that would be remembered long after the gala ended. Victoria's pride had collapsed, but she still clung to a faint hope, a desperate belief that she could somehow regain control, that her wealth and status could shield her from accountability. I could see the beads of sweat forming on her forehead, the tremor in her hands, the shallow, uneven breaths that betrayed her fear and panic. My husband's presence was steady and commanding, but I had learned to rely on my own inner strength. I no longer needed him to assert authority for me. I had become the center of my own power. I took a deliberate step forward, letting my gaze sweep across the room, locking eyes with every witness, silently asserting my position and strength. Victoria tried to interrupt, her voice rising in panic and disbelief, but I raised a hand and the room fell silent once again. "This," I said firmly, calm yet unyielding, "is not about wealth, status, or appearances. It is about respect, humanity, and integrity. Your actions, your arrogance, your cruelty have consequences, and tonight, those consequences are clear to everyone here." The crowd shifted, leaning in, fully engaged, some whispering with approval, others shaking their heads in disbelief at her behavior and the way she had been dismantled without a single raised hand or angry shout. I could feel the subtle power in my voice, my composure, the deliberate way I spoke every word, each phrase carefully measured to communicate strength without resorting to humiliation. Victoria's face was pale, lips trembling, eyes wide with the dawning realization that she had completely miscalculated. Her arrogance, her attempts to demean me, had only revealed her weakness and her inability to wield true influence. My husband gave me a small, approving nod, but I hardly noticed it was my presence, my words, my composure that had shifted the room. Victoria attempted a last-ditch effort, a trembling argument, something about appearances and influence, but it fell flat, hollow, and irrelevant. The guests around us could see it. Her power was gone, her image of superiority shattered, and the contrast between her and me had never been clearer. I felt a wave of quiet triumph, not in vengeance, but in the undeniable assertion of dignity and moral authority. The room seemed to hum with anticipation, as if waiting for Victoria to break, to retreat, to finally acknowledge that the tide had irrevocably turned. I watched as her hands clenched, then slowly relaxed, her shoulders sagging as she realized that there was nothing left to fight with, no way to reclaim her image or her influence. I had turned her own cruelty back on her, not with meanness, but with composure, clarity, and courage. The guests, sensing the shift, began to whisper with admiration, some nodding subtly, others glancing at my husband with respect for the way we had handled the situation together. But it was not just about winning this confrontation. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my sense of self that had been undermined by years of subtle mockery, scorn, and dismissal. I had learned to stand not just for myself, but for every slighted glance, every whispered insult, every moment where I had been underestimated. Victoria finally stepped back, her energy deflating completely, leaving her exposed, powerless, and fully aware that she had been bested not by anger, not by confrontation, but by unwavering self-respect and the subtle, undeniable support of truth and justice. My husband and I shared a brief, quiet glance, a wordless acknowledgement of victory, of resilience, of strength. I had survived the humiliation, and now I had turned it into empowerment. The guests slowly began to relax, sensing that the climax had passed, the drama resolved, but the impression of that night would remain etched in everyone's memory. The night arrogance met integrity, cruelty met dignity, and power was reclaimed not with wealth or status, but with composure, courage, and moral authority. I stood tall, unwavering, fully in command of the room, knowing that from this moment forward, I would never again be underestimated, dismissed, or disrespected, and that the lessons of this confrontation would resonate far beyond the walls of this gala. The room was silent, the air thick with tension, yet under that stillness, a profound sense of respect and realization settled over everyone present. Victoria had stepped back, defeated, but instead of mocking her, I chose to demonstrate grace. I could feel the weight of every gaze, not judging me, but acknowledging the transformation that had taken place not just in this room, but in the dynamics of power, respect, and dignity. My husband approached, his hand lightly brushing mine in a quiet, affirming gesture, a reminder that we stood together as equals, as partners, as a united front. The guests shifted subtly, sensing that the conflict had not just been about wealth or status, but about character, integrity, and the strength to rise above cruelty without losing one's own sense of self. Victoria's attempts at arrogance were completely dismantled, and yet I offered her no final words of retaliation, only the silent demonstration of my triumph through composure, poise, and unwavering self-respect. Her defeat was complete, not through humiliation, but through the undeniable clarity of my presence, my confidence, and my moral authority. I saw in the crowd faces that were once skeptical now reflecting admiration and a quiet awe, witnesses to the power of patience, endurance, and inner strength. Victoria turned slowly, her face pale, finally understanding that her attempts to assert superiority had failed in the most public and undeniable way, and that she had no path to reclaim the dominance she had assumed was hers by wealth alone. My husband's subtle nod reminded her, and the entire audience, that true power does not come from status or money, but from respect, courage, and the ability to rise above cruelty. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of liberation that I hadn't known for years. The humiliation, the sneers, the mockery, and the underestimation that had weighed on me were finally replaced with clarity, strength, and recognition of my own worth. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence, letting my presence alone communicate authority, composure, and dignity. Every step reinforced the truth that I had survived, I had conquered, and I had emerged stronger than anyone could have anticipated. Victoria, now silent, could only watch as I claimed this space that had always been mine, not through confrontation, but through the calm, deliberate assertion of self-respect and moral power. My husband followed, his support silent yet powerful, reminding everyone that strength is amplified not by loud words, but by steadfast presence and unwavering integrity. I turned briefly to the guests, allowing my gaze to meet theirs, acknowledging their attention, their silent respect, and the shared understanding that they had witnessed not just a confrontation, but a lesson in character, resilience, and the consequences of cruelty. Victoria, seeing the room's recognition of my dignity and strength, finally understood that humiliation is temporary, but integrity and moral authority are lasting, and that her actions had consequences far beyond what she had imagined. As the guests began to murmur in quiet acknowledgement, my husband whispered softly, "You've shown more strength than anyone here expected. You've claimed what's rightfully yours." I felt a deep, unshakable sense of fulfillment. Years of endurance, restraint, and self-discipline had culminated in this undeniable moment of triumph. The night's drama had ended, not with chaos or anger, but with clarity, empowerment, and respect. Victoria left shortly after, her departure subdued and silent, a final acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly, and that true strength lies in dignity, patience, and unwavering integrity. The guests began to disperse, many approaching to congratulate me quietly, their admiration evident in their voices and gestures. I stood with my husband, feeling the weight of victory, not as a conqueror over another, but as a woman who had reclaimed her dignity, her authority, and her sense of self in the face of cruelty, arrogance, and public humiliation. And in that moment, I knew that nothing could ever undermine me again, that grace, composure, and moral power would always triumph over arrogance and cruelty, and that the lesson of this night would echo far beyond these walls, in every challenge I faced, and every future encounter where strength, dignity, and integrity would define the outcome. The gala had ended, the guests gone, and the echoes of the confrontation still lingered in the silent halls. I stood in the quiet, finally allowing myself to exhale, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. My husband joined me, his hand finding mine, a simple yet profound gesture of unity, trust, and partnership. The ordeal with Victoria, her arrogance, her cruelty, had taught us something invaluable, not about wealth, influence, or appearances, but about resilience, integrity, and the quiet power of composure. As we walked through the empty ballroom, memories of the humiliation, the sneers, the laughter at my supposed inferiority flashed through my mind. And yet, they no longer stung. They had been transformed into fuel, a reminder of the strength I had cultivated through endurance, patience, and self-respect. I realized that the true victory was not in Victoria's defeat, but in reclaiming my own dignity, in standing unshaken, fully seen, and fully in control of my responses. My husband squeezed my hand gently, a silent acknowledgement that the unity we had displayed that night, the quiet but undeniable assertion of our moral authority, had shifted everything, not just between us, but in the perception of everyone present. I looked out over the grand chandelier-lit room one last time, imagining the murmurs, the astonished glances, the unspoken respect that lingered in the memories of the guests. It was not the wealth, the dress, or the prestige that had commanded attention. It was my composure, my unwavering resolve, and the authenticity of my presence. We stepped outside into the crisp night air, and for the first time in years, I felt completely free. Free from the judgment, the expectations, and the toxic arrogance that had tried to define me. I understood, with a clarity that only comes after enduring hardship and emerging stronger, that true power lies in the ability to rise above cruelty without compromising your own dignity. Victoria's presence would fade from my life, but the lessons of the evening, the strength, patience, and moral courage I had cultivated would remain forever. I turned to my husband, a smile finally breaking across my face, genuine and unguarded, and I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. For every challenge, every insult, every moment that had tested me, had brought me here, fully aware of my worth, my power, and my capacity to face any obstacle with unwavering grace. The night had been more than a confrontation. It had been a transformation, a reclamation of self, and a testament to the strength of integrity, patience, and resilience. As we walked away together, hand in hand, I knew that nothing could ever diminish what we had built, what we had endured, and the unshakable strength that now defined us. That evening, the world had witnessed the triumph of character over cruelty, dignity over arrogance, and resilience over humiliation. And I knew, in that quiet, powerful moment, that I would never again be underestimated, dismissed, or ignored. The chapter with Victoria had closed, but the lessons, the strength, and the courage would remain with me for a lifetime, guiding every step, every decision, and every encounter with the unshakable confidence of someone who had faced adversity and emerged stronger, wiser, and fully empowered.